now know a lot by looking back at the 15 years of, I'm just going to skip to this next slide here, looking back to the 15 years of the legacy of what's happened after the stripping of the collective agreement language. We now know that the impacts have been widespread, and they range from, the brochures that were passed out tonight details a lot of the impacts of the stripping of the language and of this sort of neoliberal policy agenda undertaken by the Campbell and subsequently Clark administrations. And that includes larger class sizes. It includes ratios. Now we have the second poorest ratio of educators to students in Canada. We now have, for example, ratios around teacher librarians that have been escalating over time. So when I was a kid in school, I would go see our teacher librarian daily, check out books, learn about literacy, etc., and learn about these types of things that teacher librarians impart. And now we have schools, for example, in districts like Coquitlam that don't actually even have a single teacher librarian on staff. So those ratios have been declining. When we look at, for example, special needs and inclusive education, we see that the number of children with special needs that are what John described earlier as level 1, 2, and 3 special needs students has climbed by over 50%. So the level and complexity of needs has been growing over the last 15 years. But if you take a look on the left of this slide here, you'll see that at the same time, during this exact same period, the government cut 24% or almost 25% of our special education teachers and completely eliminated the learning assistance teacher. So if you're a teacher in a public school where you have children who have growing complex special needs, and more with the class composition been stripped, we see that we're putting more and more children with special needs into classrooms. So we have classrooms that have 4, 5, 6 high school teachers detailing up to 10 children with individualized education plans into a classroom. That is a growing complexity that needs to be resourced. And when it's not resourced, it falls to the teacher and it falls to the child to be able to absorb the impacts of that significant cut. Those significant cuts. And what it meant on the ground were teachers describing things like children who were not able to be supported in the classroom, children who were sent home because the behavior issues became so large and complex it couldn't be effectively managed, teachers who were experiencing mass burnout and guilt and emotional distress. And for example, the rise in our mental health and well-being claims on short and long-term disability has gone up significantly over the past 15 years. There are real impacts on teachers who are out there trying to do their best for our students. And fundamentally, when we look at these two graphs, and I'm a methodologist, right? So, and a statistician here. So when we look at these graphs, I just want you to focus on the very left. That's your 2001, and then on the right, 2015, 16 on that sort of horizontal axis there. Just looking at what's happened. On the left is education as a percentage of public spending. And so you can see that's basically, that sums up education as a priority in government spending. And it's gone from a little over 20% to down to less than 12% of annual public spending. And as a percentage of GDP, it's also had this precipitous decline over the past 15 years. And that, again, that tells us about both priorities, but it also tells us that that the funding is available to be spent, that the health of the economy is not something that is driving education change. So we have to look to where those drivers exist, and they're chiefly political. And as this is also in your brochure, but this is what's been happening in terms of on a comparative basis. So we look that we're now at about $1,000 less than the national average in terms of per pupil spending. So we think about children in the education system now as of 2016-17 receiving now we're looking at even deeper than $1,000. $1,000 less than every other child in terms of the national average across Canada. So the impacts of that, as you can imagine, in the classroom are significant.
Okay.